Hello, 2BC. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're continuing our study of John, and we'll be in chapters 18 and 19 today. Will you pray with me as we get started? God, thank you so much for today. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for Jesus. And I pray that as we read your word and we talk about it and we mull over it, that we will just hear from you. You will speak to our hearts. You will teach us about yourself and about your love. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we are continuing on in our study of John's Gospel, and we are going to be in the rest of chapter 18. So you remember last week we talked about the first 11 verses of chapter 18. So this week we're going to finish up chapter 18 and go into part of 19. This is going to cover Peter's denials, Jesus being questioned by the high priest, as well as his trial before Pilate. So that's where we're taking a huge chunk of scripture. So we're not going to read it all, but we will talk through these different pieces. So when we left Jesus last week, he was in the garden, and the detachment of soldiers and the religious leaders and Judas had come to arrest him, and so they arrest him. And then our story picks up here in verse 12. So he is arrested and bound and taken to Annas. And if we look down at verse 13, we're told that he was brought first to Annas, who was father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. And then later on, he's being questioned by the high priest. And then Annas sends him to Caiaphas. If you look at verse 24, and it says, and Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So there's a little bit of confusion. Why does it seem like John is referring to Annas and Caiaphas as the high priest? Isn't there only supposed to be one? So that is an important question. It is a little bit confusing. So I thought we would start off with that little tidbit before we talk about these different sections. So Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and he was the high priest from around AD 6 to AD 15. But he was deposed by the Romans. So he was deposed by the Romans before Pilate came to power, because Pilate came to power a little bit later, and we'll talk about him specifically in a little while. And so Annas was succeeded by 5 of his sons and by Caiaphas, who was his son-in-law. But we know from the history of Judaism that the appointment of high priest was for life. But you could imagine that the Jewish people would have not been happy about the Romans meddling in their religious affairs. So they didn't have any power. The Romans didn't have any power to truly depose a high priest in the religious sense. And so the Jews would have probably continued to refer to him as the high priest. And really, it would have been kind of more like he had the power behind this entire priestly family. So it had the influence on the priesthood and continued to be a strong force, even though he didn't have the quote unquote title that the Romans would have recognized. So, and we see Luke and in Acts both referring to Annas and Caiaphas similarly to how John does here. So it is a little bit confusing, but some of the history, hopefully that helps clear up that question as we dive into this. So that it makes perfect sense that if we look down at verses 19 through 24, that Annas is the one who is doing the questioning here. And then he would have sent him off to Caiaphas, who would have assembled the Sanhedrin and the council of the Jewish leaders to have a more formal trial before the Jewish leaders. So the detachment of soldiers and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus, bound him, and took him to Annas first. And Annas then interrogates Jesus. So this is not a formal trial, because a trial in Judaism would have required witnesses. And this was just Annas questioning Jesus and trying to get him almost to self-incriminate. So he questions Jesus about his teaching. He questions him about his disciples. And we see some of what Jesus pushes back about is that there weren't witnesses present and that this was not a formal trial. So the way a trial would have worked is the judge would not have talked to the defendant. Instead, the judge would have talked to the witnesses, and the witnesses would have come and would have been the ones doing the speaking and presenting the information. And then they would come together, after hearing the witnesses' statements, they would decide whether or not the defendant was guilty. So Jesus, in response to Annas' interrogating, reminds him that he has not been teaching in secret and says, go and talk to witnesses. Go and talk to the people who've heard me teaching. I've been in the synagogues. I have been out in the open at the temple where everyone comes together. They have all heard the things that I say. So why are you asking me? Ask the witnesses. Ask those people who heard. And this explains, so if you look in verse 22, one of the officials nearby slaps Jesus in the face after he says this, and says, is this the way you're to answer the high priest? And then Jesus says, if I did something wrong, testify as to what I did, what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? So Jesus is reminding Annas of appropriate, proper judicial procedure. There are no witnesses. This is not the way to go about a proper trial. And so then after Annas is unsuccessful in getting Jesus to self-incriminate or say anything that he could use against him in any way, he sends him on to Caiaphas. And so we can think of this as Caiaphas is the acting high priest, and because that's what it says in verse 24, he sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And Caiaphas would have, while Annas is trying to interrogate Jesus, then Caiaphas is then assembling the Sanhedrin so they can have a more formal trial. Now, John does not record Jesus' trial before Caiaphas. We do have that in other Gospels, but John does not record it. But he does record the meeting of the Sanhedrin earlier on. If you wanted to look back at I think it is John 11. And we have Caiaphas talking about how it's better for one man to die than for the people than for all of them to die. So if you look at John 11, that starting in verse 45 and kind of to the end of that chapter, that there's a meeting of the Sanhedrin there. So they've already kind of decided that Jesus was needed to die. So John does not narrate this trial here. So while this is going on with Jesus inside with Annas and he's being interrogated, we see Peter's story woven in here. So starting in verse 15, we're told that Peter and another disciple were following Jesus, but that this other disciple was known to the high priest, and so he was able to go into the courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside, but this other disciple was able to come back, spoke to the servant girl, and brought him in. So this unnamed disciple, scholars have posited that it is John, that it is the beloved disciple, but really we just don't know for sure who it was. And it's at this point that Peter is first questioned. So the servant girl asks him, "You aren't one of the man's disciples too, are you?" And he responds, "I am not." And then, so he's in this courtyard with these servants and officials around a fire. So perhaps even some of the ones who were in the garden whenever Jesus was arrested. So maybe even some of them saw Peter whip out his sword and slice off someone's ear, all of those things. So you can imagine Peter is completely bewildered at this point. But why does he choose to deny Jesus, right? It seems somewhat surprising, other than the fact that Jesus already told him that it was going to happen, but it seems surprising because Peter was not a coward, right? He's the first one to whip out his weapon and try to take action in the garden, which, Jesus does condemn it, but Peter's not a coward, right? But I wonder what changed for him as he watches Jesus allow himself to be arrested and taken. I wonder what changes. I wonder how he was feeling. I would imagine certainly very confused, bewildered, maybe flabbergasted, just not really sure exactly what to do. And then he's being pressed by this servant girl. "Aren't you one of his followers too?" "Oh, no, not me." Right? And then if you look down in verse 25, we have his second and third denials. And it says that Peter was still standing there warming himself, and they ask him, "Aren't you one of the disciples?" And he says, "I'm not." And then one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and then immediately a rooster began to crow. But based on the end of this one, I think Peter was feeling extremely vulnerable, right? He's standing here, and now a relative of the man that he injured is right there. Someone who says, I think I saw you in the garden. So Peter, as at the moment that Jesus is able to testify truthfully and faithfully, Peter is outside. So Jesus is inside doing that, and Peter is outside denying him and being unfaithful. This contrast between Jesus and Peter is so interesting in how John weaves these two stories together. Jesus doesn't deny anything. He doesn't deny what he taught. He doesn't deny that he is who he says he is. And we're going to continue to see that as we get into the trial before Pilate. But Peter denies everything. Such a contrast. So we can hear, starting like before we get to verse 28, we can kind of hear that there would have been a pause here in the story. And it's told just, one thing after another. But remember, this would have been late at night when Jesus was arrested and when this interrogation is going on. And then there's a trial before the Sanhedrin. And so then he's taken to Pilate early in the morning, the next morning. So early in the early hours of the next morning. So there was some sort of passage of time, a lengthy passage of time before that next morning. So starting in John 18:28, we get this story of Jesus' trial before Pilate. And John's account is much more detailed than the other Gospels in this section. So Pilate was the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea, and he ruled from around the year 26 to the year 36 AD, and he would have been in charge of the entire province of Judea, and so he would have spent most of his time actually in Caesarea because there would have been troops there, stationed there. But there were also some troops stationed in Jerusalem. Remember, we talked about the Antonia fortress that was near the temple. That would have been where troops would have been stationed. Roman troops would have been stationed in Jerusalem, and he would have, when he was in Jerusalem, he probably would have used the palace of Herod the Great, which was on the west hill and it overlooked the city. And so Pilate would have been in Jerusalem at this time specifically because of the Passover. You remember we've talked about the extreme influx of people in the city and how the city almost couldn't contain them all. They would stay out in the surrounding areas. And so all of these people coming in for Passover. So it would make complete sense that Pilate would be in Jerusalem, maybe with some extra troops for that time, for that festival. So Jesus is taken to the palace of the governor. And so do we know exactly if it was the fortress or if it was actually the palace of Herod the Great? We don't know exactly, but the Praetorium, he was taken to the palace of the governor. That is what it says. And he is taken there, but the Jews don't enter. So the Jewish religious leaders don't enter because they don't want to become unclean. And the reason they had to take Jesus to Pilate was because the Sanhedrin, which was the Jews' highest court, did not have the power to inflict capital punishment. And they needed Pilate. They needed the Roman governor because the Romans closely guarded that function. Only the Romans had the power to inflict capital punishment, and they were masters at killing people in terrible ways. And you can read the pages of history for that. And so that was something that they protected. They wanted to have the power to do that. So if you look in verse 31, Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." And they say, "But we have no right to execute anyone." And so they needed Pilate and his condemnation as well in order for Jesus to be executed. Now, Pilate wouldn't have been completely surprised by the fact that they were coming to him simply because he was already somewhat in the loop, because you remember there was a detachment of soldiers in the garden. But he's essentially saying, well, I helped you get your guy. Now, why are you coming back to me? So he already knew a little bit of what's going on, but now he's finding out, oh, they really want me to condemn him to be executed. And so Pilate then goes on to interrogate Jesus for himself. So a couple things to note as you look through this section, because we're not going to really read it all, but to note the inside outside. So Pilate goes outside to talk to the Jews and he goes inside to talk to Jesus, and we'll see this scene shift throughout the whole thing. So he goes out, talks to them, comes in, asks Jesus some questions. We'll go back out and tell them what is going on. John is making it clear here that Jesus is being condemned as a king and that he dies as a king. And I think that's such an interesting thing. So let's look at that and let's see how John brings that out. So Pilate goes in back inside and asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus' response, "Is that your own idea?" This is in verse 34. "Or did others talk to you about me?" And then Jesus goes on and says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." And then Pilate says, "You are a king then." And Jesus says, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Pilate responds with, "What is truth?" And then he goes back out to the Jews. So it's interesting here because even Pilate is saying, "Are you a king?" And Jesus is saying, "Well, my kingdom doesn't look like what you're expecting." So Pilate is wanting to know, are you a king, like I think, a political king who is going to come and you might be then guilty of sedition, of usurping the government and trying to overthrow things. So are you a king? And Jesus is saying, well, my kingdom is not what you think it is. So here in the midst of this trial, Jesus is redefining what his kingship is in the midst of this. Because here Pilate just wants to keep the peace, right? The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, that's his main goal. We don't want an uprising in the middle of this festival, and we're going to see him continue to ultimately decide to execute Jesus because of what is going on here, and it just keeps escalating. And that is one of the reasons why he finally consents to having Jesus executed, is to keep the peace in Rome. But here Jesus is saying, well, I'm not the kind of king you think I am. My kingdom isn't of this world, because if it was, my people would defend me and fight for me. And we know Jesus condemned fighting on his behalf in the garden. Told Peter, no, don't do that. We're not going to do this. We're not going to fight for this kingdom. That's not the kind of kingdom this is. So he tells Pilate what his kingdom is not, which is not as of this world. But then he also says that it is a kingdom of truth. He tells him what his kingdom is. Came into this world to testify to the truth. And Pilate just doesn't get it, right? He gets it in the sense that he doesn't think that Jesus is guilty, because he goes back out to the Jews and says, I find no basis for a charge against him. And then he keeps, for several times, will continue to try to release Jesus. So Pilate just doesn't understand fully what Jesus is saying, but he understands enough to know that Jesus is innocent. He does not find a basis for this charge. So he goes back out to the Jews and tells them this. I don't see a basis for this charge. But then, he attempts to try to release Jesus. And so he appeals to this custom of releasing a prisoner at the time of the Passover. And we really don't have any extra biblical, so outside of the Bible, evidence for this tradition, but there's no reason for us to question whether or not it existed. It's just, it's not really recorded anywhere else. But all the Gospels do record it. And it says, it's a custom to release a prisoner. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? So do you want me to release Jesus? And the crowd shouts back, no, we want Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an uprising. So here, this is such an ironic thing here, because Barabbas was a threat to Rome and Jesus wasn't. So they're asking for the person who had committed the crime that they were, that Pilate would be concerned about, right? Causing an uprising, but not the one who is about being the Prince of Peace. And when this tactic doesn't work, so it backfires, people don't want Jesus released. So when this tactic doesn't work, then Pilate decides, oh, well, maybe I can just have him flogged, and then maybe that will appease them and it will be enough, and we don't have to go all the way to execution. And so we see that's what happens at the beginning of 19. He's flogged. There is a mock coronation where the soldiers put a crown of thorns on him and throw a robe around him and hail King of the Jews and slap him in the face and all of those things. And then Pilate brings Jesus back out to the people, to the Jews, and says, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. That's 19:4. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here is the man. And as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. And Pilate again keeps pushing back and saying, I don't see any basis for a charge against him. And then here's what the Jews do. They turn it just a little bit further and they say, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. So, and Pilate is going to hear this and it's going to raise his superstitions. So he is going to be concerned about what is happening here, because he isn't worshiping God, the one true God, but he worships many gods and knows that in their stories that sometimes they come down and impersonate people. And so this is going to arouse his concerns from a superstitious point of view. So again, he goes back in to talk to Jesus because he really doesn't want him to be executed. And Jesus' response to him is, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. So he kept trying. Pilate keeps trying to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders just got louder and louder and kept pushing back. And finally, they said their trump card, which I think is very interesting. If you look in verse 12, it says, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. So this title of friend of Caesar was actually an official title that was conferred by the emperor to those who showed a special loyalty and service to the emperor. And I believe Pilate had that title, but this title could be retracted and the emperor then could take it away and the person could be executed or tortured, all the different things that you could imagine would happen if someone lost the title of friend of Caesar. Because to not be a friend of Caesar was most likely to be an enemy of Caesar, especially if you had the title taken away. So when Pilate heard this, he knew he was done for. And it's at this point that he brings Jesus out and he says, I'm going to just read this section right here because John includes some very specific details. He brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat. So Pilate, this is verse 13, Pilate brings Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat. The place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. So John gives us some very specific details. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So Pilate finally relents and lets them have their way. But it's interesting here because in the midst of doing this, in the midst of pronouncing this judgment, we have this, shall I crucify your king, down in verse 15. And the chief priests answer, we have no king but Caesar. So they have no king but Caesar. But who is supposed to be their king? God's supposed to be their king. So not only are they rejecting Jesus, which we know is God incarnate, God in flesh, but they were rejecting the kingship of God. So this rejection of Jesus as the Messiah, this rejection of the kingship of Jesus is complete here. And Pilate allows them to take Jesus away to be crucified. And they, meaning he hands him over to the guards, the Roman guards, to take him to be crucified. And we'll talk about the crucifixion specifically next week. I think one of the things that, as we read through this, I said John makes it clear that as a king, Jesus is condemned, and as a king, he is taken to die. And I think we see that here. We see that through what Jesus says. We see that through this mock coronation thing. And Pilate refers to him as the king of the Jews whenever he brings him out. And we'll see that again next week as we read about the crucifixion. But also we see that Jesus entered into our sufferings. Right? He is rejected. He endures that rejection. He endures this physical suffering. And so he enters in to human history in this specific time, in this specific place to carry out God's work of redemption of all humanity. And it is intense. And when we actually think about it and we think about the flogging and the things that Jesus endured on our behalf, it can be overwhelming and it can be sobering and it can be heartbreaking. But it also makes me just realize the depth of God's love for us. That he is willing to send Jesus to endure the cross, to endure all of this humiliation and rejection and pain on our behalf. That's the depth of his love for us. How the lengths that he will go to in order to redeem humanity. So next week, we will continue on in chapter 19, and we'll be reading and talking about the crucifixion. And I hope you'll join me, and we'll talk about it. See you next week. Bye.